The Teutonic Order was an order of German knights formed outside of the city of Acre during the failed Third Crusade. It was here, in the 1190s AD, that the newfound order, modeled closely on the original charter of the Order of St. John, became commissioned for military action against the heathen and would become a military order known for pagan hunting and warmongering in the coming centuries. The Teutonic Order began as a hospital for the German knights wounded in the fighting outside Acre. The mostly French-speaking Knights Hospitaller were very selective in their recruitment, and the needs for medical services left great numbers of German nobility and soldiers without care or burial rights. While the Germans were not formally excluded from the French hospitals of the Order of St. John, language and cultural barriers led to a separate German brotherhood caring for their own wounded. As such, a group of German traders began to treat their fellow countrymen, and thus the word Teutonic, after the Latin Teutonicus for German, gave name to the newest Crusader organization in the Holy Lands. Later, when the need for more soldiers grew, the order was changed to incorporate knights and make possible the recapture of cities and towns which were very rapidly being conquered by the Muslim forces. Despite their origins in the Holy Lands, the Teutonic Knights are primarily known for their rule of and campaigns against the Prussians and other Eastern European pagans who had resisted conversion for centuries. Their conversion, disruption, and resettlement of heathen Baltic lands would later result in the holy wars known as the Northern Crusades. Though formed in Acre, the Teutonic Order had taken opportunities for work outside of the Holy Land. On one occasion, the Kingdom of Hungary requested the aid of Teutonic forces in order to withstand the invasions of the pagan Cuman tribes on the eastern borders of their lands. The knights were then conscripted by the Hungarian kingdom and began to build up their presence in Transylvania, establishing several castle fortifications in the span of only a few years. As their success and territorial possessions in Hungary accrued, the Hungarians began to be anxious of the greedy intentions of the Teutonic Order. They became suspicious that when the conflict against the Cumans ended, the Teutonic Order would not be willing to leave. Wearing out their welcome in Hungary, the knights soon received another invitation, this time from Duke Conrad of Mazovia, one of the most senior authorities in Polish lands at the time. Duke Conrad's realm extended northwest on the edge of Polish territory, but had been subject to increasing violence and encroachment by the pagan Prussian peoples. These confederations of tribal heathens were among the last remaining groups of pre-Christian pagans in Europe. In fact, several other Baltic peoples had already been a target of the Livonian Brothers of the Sword, who had sought the forced conversion of the Estonian tribes in the north. In the south, the Prussians and Lithuanians still maintained their independent way of life, weaved among the marshy swamplands and dense forests of the Baltic Sea's east coast. Upon Duke Conrad's invitation, the Teutonic Order agreed to launch military campaigns against the old Prussian pagans. These conflicts flared up at different times, but can primarily be associated with the Livonian Crusade, beginning in 1198 through 1290, the Prussian Crusade, from 1217 to 1274, and the Lithuanian Crusade, from 1283 to 1410. Before the Teutonic Order, the first major conflict involving crusaders against the Baltic pagans was fought in modern-day Estonia in a conflict called the Livonian Crusade. The Livonian Crusade was officially sanctioned by Pope Innocent III in the year 1198 and primarily targeted the peoples of Livonia, a stretch of territory belonging at that time to the Finno-Ugric peoples in modern-day Estonia and Latvia. At the time, the only Catholic stronghold in the region was the newly built port city of Riga, which was founded in the year 1201 as an outpost in the middle of pagan Baltic territory. Crusaders of German, Scandinavian, and Slavic origin began to congregate in Riga for campaigns along the Baltic coast. Many of them fought with the Order of the Livonian Brothers of the Sword. The rewards for participation in this crusade were very high, and much more feasible for Western crusaders than a trip across the Mediterranean. Some indulgences for participation in these military conversions included the equivalent of making a pilgrimage to Rome. Those who fought in the Baltic could pay for their sins by participation in the Northern Crusades. As with the Crusades in the Holy Land, a mix of personal ambition and piety prevailed in the Crusaders as individuals and within their respective orders. The Livonian Brothers of the Sword, or Sword Brethren, were the main group of knights who were fighting the Livonians and were the first major crusading order in the Baltic region. While called in 1198, this crusade would not end until the year 1290 and would coincide with the following Lithuanian and Prussian Crusades. Though resistant to setbacks, the Sword Brethren had been humbled over long conflicts and unsuccessful conquest fighting against the Estonian tribes. The 1210s and early 1220s saw major defeats by the crusading forces. The Sword Brothers were greatly reduced in numbers from bloody and very costly fighting, but survived on the perpetual arrival of new Danish, Swedish, and German knights. Their numbers swelled in the late 1220s, and the tide began to turn against the Estonians. One of the final and dramatic examples of resistance against the Crusaders can be seen in the Battle of Muhu. Muhu was a fort on the island of Saaremaa, protected by the sea and from attacks in the summer months. But in January of 1227, the winter weather froze the sea around Saaremaa, allowing the Crusaders to drag their heavy knights, horses, and siege engines across the ice. The fort of Muhu was besieged, and despite fierce fighting, it was captured. According to some chronicles, many or all of the defenders were killed. This kind of brutality in total warfare, which was introduced in the Livonian Crusade, became the precedent for the future wars along the Baltic coast. Captured forts, villages, and towns were almost always massacred. The more the Baltic pagans rebelled, the more cruel the crusading knights became when they returned with fresh volunteers from around Europe. The battle at Muhu ended the dominance of paganism among many of the mainland Estonian tribes. However, the island of Saaremaa, forced into Christendom, later rebelled in the 1230s, renouncing Catholicism. Owing to such rebellions on Saaremaa and defeats on the mainland against the Lithuanians and Samogitians, the Livonian Brothers of the Sword were nearly wiped out. In 1237, they were officially absorbed into the Order of the Teutonic Knights, who persisted against the Livonian revolts for decades to come. In the midst of the Livonian Crusade, the Teutonic Order had arrived to the south of Livonia in Prussia in small and weak contingents. They were still distracted by the wars in the Middle East and resource commitments in Transylvania against the Cumans. However, over the next few decades, they would establish a militarized state which would rival the great powers of the Middle Ages. The fourth Grand Master of the Order, Hermann von Salza, was in office at the time of the arrival in Northern Europe. He was shrewd in his political and military strategy and secured for the Teutonic Knights the support of both the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor. the two leading authorities in Catholic Europe. With their commission from higher powers in the faith, the Teutonic Knights began a ruthless elimination and displacement of the Prussian people. They first built up defensible forts and used seasonal tactics, waiting until the summer to launch their assaults into the forest and retreating to their castles in the winter. The Pope had granted the Teutonic Order a perpetual crusade, allowing them to recruit year-round from German-speaking regions and ensuring their numbers were maintained for raids. Their dominance extended beyond warfare. The Teutonic Order gained the control of many port cities and trading hubs of the emerging Hanseatic League, allowing their markets and trade to thrive. Each year, they made more advancements in their economic position and struck further into the territory of the Prussians. Though ferocious and wild fighters, the Prussians were far inferior in military technology. Their only real advantage was that they still vastly outnumbered the Teutonic Knights. The Prussians also suffered from internal conflict. Their way of life was common to various clans in the region, but tribal and family disputes often caused blood feuds to erupt. It was very rare for these tribes to unite against the Teutonic Knights, even when they were pressed against the wall. Some Christians among the Baltic peoples, converted by early missionaries, eventually joined the Teutonic Knights either by force or compulsion. Without the unity, organization, or defenses of the Germans, the Baltic peoples in Prussia retreated further into the forest, each year losing land and forsaking their hill forts and small towns. Within a span of 50 years, the once dominant Prussians were almost entirely defeated. Their homeland became dotted with forts and castles under the administration of Marienburg, the chief castle town of the Teutonic Order. The Prussian language was erased, and though some refugees fled to Lithuania, most of the surviving Prussians were subjected to forced conversion and ideological re-education. Though they never fully conquered the lands northeast of Prussia, the Knights rapidly consolidated control of most of the former pagan territory. Their state-building efforts and religious adaptation left a lasting impact in the region. Nonetheless, pagan traditions persisted among the local populations for generations afterward and would be the seed of future rebellions. After a few decades of war, the Prussian Crusade ended in 1274 with the defeat of Prussia and the growing power of the Teutonic Knights, looking with determination at the last pagan stronghold in the Baltic. Up to this point, Lithuania had remained steadfast as the last independent pre-Christian nation in Europe. It was now the central hub and last stand of all the previously conquered people of the Baltic coast. Old Prussians, Curonians, Samogitians, Livs, and others converged in Lithuania, bringing in multiple pre-Christian Baltic traditions. These pan-Baltic tribes practiced a variety of different folk religions. The strong emphasis on ancestor worship, fire cults, and animism made the connection with their land very important and spiritually significant. A mixing of the various tribal religions had made Lithuania into an ethnic and spiritual melting pot. They gathered over vast stretches of land, and though fortified strongholds existed, they were mostly used for seasonal defense and staging camps for raids. There was little civilizational development in these areas, with no centralized government system, making unity among the Baltic and Finnic peoples especially difficult. Compared to the Catholics, who had a unifying religion, society, authority in the Grand Master, the Pope, and the Emperor, the Baltic peoples were overmatched by the order in all but numbers. Yet, the Lithuanians remained an elusive thorn in the Teutonic side. The Knights of the Order maintained their dominion in the Baltic region for many decades following the former Livonian and Prussian Crusades. However, they were never able to deal with pagan Lithuania to the same degree that they were able to do so with the Prussians before them. At times, the Lithuanians took back territories and in their ambushes killed many Teutonic knights. The pressure on Lithuania at this time was extreme. They were beset on their western borders by Catholic armies and by Russian Orthodox forces on their eastern borders. The encroachment of Christendom was slowly advancing. Although the Lithuanian people would not go from their old ways overnight, the Christianization of Lithuania had officially been initiated. There were at times fierce rebellions against Teutonic rule before the end of the 14th century. However, the conquest was ultimately undermined when Lithuania finally Christianized. Conflicts over the centuries culminated in the year 1387, when Grand Duke of Lithuania, Jogaila, united with the Polish monarch by marrying the Polish queen and joining their realms as one Christian kingdom. A cathedral began construction in Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania, and the remaining shrines, temples, and sacred places of their old religion were abandoned. However, this was not the news which the Teutonic Knights were eager to hear. Their reason for existing had become the conquest of Lithuania, Christian or not. They continued to make incursions against the Lithuanians, with the objective of securing a land they had expected to gain had Lithuania not converted. But the Lithuanians, now allied to the Polish, were not willing to be taken advantage of. As a pretext, the Poles had been accused by the Teutonic Order of heresy and Lithuania of a false conversion. These conflicts began to boil over, and by the year 1410, a mass of Teutonic knights had mustered on their southern border to repel a combined force of Polish and Lithuanian troops. This would become one of the biggest battles ever fought in medieval Europe. After the conversion and baptism of the Grand Duke of Lithuania, the Teutonic Order had to choose whether they would accept the conversion of the Lithuanians, who had allied with the Poles, or if they would continue their pursuit of more lands and resources against the new Catholics. It was the latter policy which prevailed, and the Lithuanians and Teutonic Knights still fought skirmishes across their borders even after the Lithuanian conversion. Wanting to keep the crusading Europeans coming to the Baltic from the west, the Teutonic Order built up the military in preparation for another invasion into Lithuanian territory. These efforts culminated in the year 1410 near the village of Grunwald. The Battle of Grunwald, as it was later called, was fought in the summer between a force of Teutonic knights, crusaders, and mercenaries against the Polish king, the Lithuanian Grand Duke, and their Tatar and Mongol mercenaries. The Lithuanians had joined with the forces of the Polish king several days earlier along the banks of the Vistula River, and crossed into Prussian lands that belonged to the Teutonic Order. There are accounts of raiding and pillaging by the Tatar groups among the Polish-speaking villages in the Teutonic territory. Though Polish-speaking, these villages were loyal to the Teutonic Order. Even so, the Polish king is said to have reprimanded the atrocities committed by his Tatar allies. The Teutonic Knights had seen the encroaching army and followed them alongside the opposite end of the Vistula River. Though less in number, they were much more organized and had the advantage of many guest crusaders and Teutonic knights in their ranks. Some 250 heavily armored and mounted knights, a very substantial portion of the Teutonic administration, were riding with the army. In addition to this, there were armored peasants and siege weapons, including some cannons. After some maneuvering, the Teutonic Knights were able to attack the Lithuanian and Polish forces by surprise, but instead, owing to chivalry, the Grand Master of the Teutonic Order sent the Polish king 2 unsheathed swords as a way of challenging him in battle. Many historians consider this to be one of the first fatal errors made by the Grand Master. By doing this, he had given away his advantage of a surprise attack. Thus, the Poles and Lithuanians were allowed to form up well after the Teutonic lines had sat for hours in the hot summer sun. The contingents of troops were positioned with the guest crusaders matched against the Tartars, and the Teutonic and Prussian knights against the Polish and Lithuanian cavalry. Having learned from the influence of the Mongols to the east, the Lithuanians had adopted many of their tactics and fought more similarly to the Mongols than to the knights of the west. It was one of these tactics, the feigned retreat, which changed the battle, initially a stalemate, into a total rout. Although debated by historians as to whether it was in fact a real retreat, the Lithuanians pulled away from their fighting early and began in their retreat to drop loot and treasures. This gesture signaled to the Teutonic knights the legitimacy of their retreat. It was at this point that they pressed ahead and were able to break the ranks of the Polish-Lithuanian army. However, the retreating force was turned back against them in a surprised flanking formation. In such an immobile and vulnerable position, the knights, who were the most valuable warriors in the battle, were massacred. This demoralized the remainder of the army, and shortly after, the banners of the Teutonic knights were captured, and a full retreat ensued. Slaughter along the way outpaced those who were slain on the battlefield, and before any of the knights reached their camp, most of the soldiers fighting for the Teutonic Order were dead or wounded. Though the battle was also costly for the Lithuanians and the Poles, it saw over 200 of the 250 Teutonic knights and ranking officers killed. This was a blow which completely decimated the Order's administrative control for years to come. Officers of the Order who survived the battle were never able to reorganize the now vacant positions into a manageable government. Though disorganized, the Teutonic Order was still able to defend and retain possession of the capital castle Marienburg from the invading force with the remainder of their military. However, the crippling and startling defeat of the knights in the Battle of Grunwald saw the end of their dominance in the Eastern Baltic. The Teutonic Order had been one of the most powerful militarized orders of the Middle Ages. Their campaigns in modern Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania led to the destruction of paganism in Europe. However, after the Battle of Grunwald, they never recovered their former influence. The Teutonic Order's declining power made for the rise of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the centuries to come. Though persisting in small ways for years, the conflicts of the Northern Crusades rapidly deteriorated after the Battle of Grunwald. The interior territories of Lithuania, including the dense forests of Samogitia and the far northwest, continued to practice paganism well into the 15th century. Their beliefs absorbed Christian practices rather than disappearing altogether. To this day, Lithuania is known as the last bastion of paganism in Europe.